order. Let me introduce our witnesses. Our first witness today is Mr. Erik Milito, Director of Upstream and Industry Operations at the American Petroleum Institute. Mr. Milito received his bachelor's degree in business administration from Notre Dame and his law degree from Marquette University. Our next witness today is Dr. Bernard Weinstein. Weinstein? Stein, got it. I'm Bridenstine, so everybody calls me Bridenstine. So. Professor and Associate Director at the Maguire Energy Institute at Southern Methodist University's Cox School of Business. Dr. Weinstein received his bachelor's degree in public administration from Dartmouth University and his master's degree and PhD in economics from Columbia. Our third witness today is Mr. Elgie Holstein. Holstein, got it. Senior Director for Strategic Planning at the Environmental Defense Fund. Mr. Holstein received his bachelor's degree from Syracuse University. Our final witness today is Mr. Anthony Ventello, Executive Director of Progress Authority. Mr. Ventello received his bachelor's degree in Geographic and Regional Planning from Mansfield University, his master's degree in Public Administration from Marywood University, and his American Economic Development Council certification from Penn State. I now recognize Mr. Milito for 5 minutes for your opening testimony.
Thank you, Chairman Bridenstine, Ranking Member Bonamici, and members of the subcommittee. My name is Erik Milito, and I'm the Director of Upstream and Industry Operations for the American Petroleum Institute. We have witnessed a dramatic transformation of the energy landscape over the past 10 years, both here in the U.S. and globally. Looking back 10 years ago, we spoke in terms of energy scarcity, and the expectation was that we as a country would be importing billions of dollars of natural gas from places like the Middle East, Russia, and West Africa. The outlook was the same on the petroleum side. We were expecting U.S. oil production to flatten or decline to about 5 million barrels per day. Fortunately, we have experienced an energy resurgence that has brought with it tremendous benefits for everyday Americans. We as a nation rely on oil and natural gas in everything that we do, from getting to work, getting our kids to school, to heating and cooling our homes, and to using the stovetop to put dinner on the table. Because of innovation and the advancement of engineering technologies such as hydraulic fracturing and horizontal drilling, the U.S. is now the world's largest natural gas producer. And on the petroleum side, we've increased our production from 5 million barrels a day in 2009 to a peak of 9.4 million barrels a day. And this is all because of advanced technology, hydraulic fracturing, horizontal drilling, and being able to tap into those resources in our shale formations. Clearly, we now speak in terms of energy abundance. Consumers are the first ones to benefit from our energy resurgence. A recent study by IHS concludes that the average household had an additional $1,300 in 2015 because of U.S. shale gas production. AAA estimates that the average American saved $550 at the pump in 2015, and this also relates to U.S. crude oil production. We have also seen major benefits from a global geopolitical and energy security standpoint. The U.S. now plays a major role in global energy markets, and this has helped our allies tremendously because there are now greater, more diverse energy supplies on the global market. We have proven as a nation and as an industry that we are able to achieve these economic and national security benefits while not only protecting the environment, but by providing tangible environmental benefits. From a climate standpoint, the U.S. has seen its greenhouse gas emissions drop to 20-year lows. This is directly attributable to the increased use of clean-burning, abundant, affordable natural gas in the power generation sector. Not only has natural gas helped us achieve important reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, but it also produces little to no particulate matter, nitrogen dioxide, and sulfur dioxide, contributing to cleaner air for all Americans. Interestingly enough, in spite of this dramatic increase in U.S. production of natural gas, emissions of methane from our industry have decreased over the past 20 years. Now, the story here is the same. We've accomplished this by advancing the technologies to ensure that we are capturing methane, which is the primary component of natural gas. We have shown that the solution to addressing methane emissions is through the development and application of technologies through innovation, not through a command and control regulatory approach that can effectively stifle innovation and add unnecessary costs. I'd like to point out that methane emissions were declining before EPA promulgated any regulations, demonstrating that these regulations are simply not necessary. Our policies should effectively promote U.S. energy production and the benefits for everyday Americans, not jeopardize the success that we have achieved and that we should continue to achieve with smart policy choices. Thank you. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you for testimony. Dr. Weinstein, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, for the opportunity to speak today. I'm Bernard Weinstein. I'm Associate Director of the Maguire Energy Institute, as the chairman mentioned. And we do a bunch of things at the Institute. We do student education, professional development, and we also do research on energy issues and policies. And we've worked for a number of organizations, done studies most recently for the Small Gasoline Retailers Coalition. We've worked with the Nuclear Energy Institute, Consumer Energy Alliance. We've done some work for the American Wind Energy Association. So we're across the board when it comes to energy. But we're here to talk about methane, especially errant methane. And we all know this is a potent greenhouse gas, and we don't want a lot of it going into the air. Recently, as you know, EPA did finalize a rule requiring drilling companies to install new monitoring equipment on production and transmission of oil and natural gas. EPA itself estimates the compliance costs, will reach about $530 million annually by 2025. And they're also developing new regs for existing wells and processing equipment. And the question is, and I guess the question at this hearing is, do we really need more federal intervention, more regulatory oversight? How big a problem are we dealing with? And if you could put up the first slide. Mr. Milito mentioned this, but you can see that U.S. methane emissions today are lower than they were in 1990. And when you consider that the economy is 75% larger and that oil and gas production is nearly doubled, that is a pretty amazing accomplishment. And what's more, again, as Mr. Milito mentioned, only about 23% of errant methane is attributable to the oil and gas industry, and that's been declining. Emissions from frack wells are down 79%. Down 94% from pipelines. There are other sources of methane, as we all know, that probably contribute a lot more: wetlands, agriculture, landfills, et cetera. We heard the chairman talking about different studies. I refer to those studies in my filed testimony, so I won't repeat the findings. But even if we did shut in all of our oil and gas wells, that would have little or no impact on the environment as long as other countries continue doing what they're doing. I mean, China builds a new coal plant every week. Turkey just announced they're building 30 new coal plants. There are 50 or 60 on the drawing boards in India. And so I think we need a dose of realism when we talk about what we can do in the United States. And I would argue that we've done a lot. If you put the next slide up, carbon emissions, again, we've already heard this, have dropped dramatically over the past decade. You can see that on the right. They've dropped by about 1 trillion tons per year, which again is pretty incredible. And why does this happen? It's because we're using more natural gas. And because we're substituting natural gas in power generation for coal, we're using more natural gas in transportation, we're using more natural gas in industrial boilers, and that is helping to clean up the environment. Now, I would argue that greater use of natural gas, not EPA regulations, deserves most of the credit for our reductions in greenhouse gases, and to some degree methane. So I'm an economist. Economists, I think, would all agree that regulation is not cost-free. And if you're going to impose new regulations, there are going to be economic consequences. As you know, the oil and gas industry has been under some stress of late. I'm not sure it would make a lot of political sense to apply new regulations, new costs in the industry today, especially because the industry on its own has taken steps to capture errant methane. I would argue that voluntary and market-based solutions to reducing methane make a lot more sense and can probably achieve the administration's goals better than new EPA regulations. If we monitor everything, we're simply wasting resources. In my prepared testimony, I discuss a voluntary program called One Future, in which a number of gas producers are working with EDF to reduce methane leaks to less than 1% of production. Maybe Mr. Holstein is going to talk about that program. I don't believe they're doing that out of environmental altruism. I think they're doing it because it makes economic sense, because methane has value. So why wouldn't you want to capture it? It's used for power, it's used for heating, it's used for transportation, it's used for petrochemicals. If there are market-based or voluntary solutions that can achieve the goals of regulation at lower costs, those are the ones that should be pursued first. So thanks for your attention. I'm happy to answer any questions at the appropriate time.
Thank you, Dr. Weinstein. Mr. Holstein, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Smith, nice to see you again, and Ranking Member Bonamici, members of the subcommittee. I'm very grateful for this opportunity to discuss the role of methane with you today as a potent greenhouse gas pollutant and the need for EPA's rules to guide the industry in minimizing those emissions. Our scientific understanding of the extent of methane pollution and its effects has been growing steadily. And mostly in the last several years have we been getting a better scientific handle on the extent of the pollution and its impacts. But there is no question at this point that methane is a powerful and harmful climate pollutant. As Ms. Bonamici mentioned, over the first 20 years following its release, methane is some 84 times more potent than CO2 in terms of the climate damage that it does. So while CO2 is of concern and does represent a continuing long-term threat, methane drives near-term climate effects. The result is that 25% of the global warming we are experiencing right now is due to methane emissions. And that's why we need action to address both sides of that equation. Across our economy, the oil and gas sector represents 33% of U.S. methane emissions, and it's the largest of all industrial U.S. sources. EPA's latest inventory estimates that in 2014, oil and gas industry operations released 9.8 million metric tons of methane into the atmosphere, and that was a 34% increase over their previous estimates. That amount of methane packs the same climate punch over the first 20 years after its release as the CO2 emissions from more than 220 coal-fired power plants. And 220 plants is more than half of the coal plants we have in this country. But the good news is that doing something about methane pollution, including complying with EPA's methane rules, can be accomplished at low cost using existing technology. ICF Incorporated did a landmark study in 2014 in which they found that a relative handful of specific remedial actions could yield a 40% reduction in methane emissions from the oil and gas sector at an average cost of about 1 cent per 1,000 cubic feet of gas produced. As I mentioned, EPA's recent inventory reflected an increase of 34% over previous estimates. But we would suggest that that number is still understated because scientific evidence suggests that even that dramatic revision does not reflect the additional methane pollution represented by high, random emissions coming from a small percentage of sites. This kind of distribution, in which large volumes are emitted from a relatively small percentage of sites, is characteristic of methane leakage in the oil and gas sector. For that reason, leak detection and repair programs, such as those required by EPA's rules and under some state programs, are an essential part of addressing the methane emissions problems. EPA's recently finalized new source performance standards for methane pollution build on successful regulatory frameworks that have been adopted over the last several years in some leading energy-producing states such as Colorado and Wyoming. So while we support EPA's action to control oil and gas sources of methane emissions from new and modified sources, we also strongly encourage the agency to keep making progress toward addressing methane emissions from existing sources. Again, according to ICF, nearly 90% of the oil and gas methane emissions in 2018 will have come from sources that were already in existence by 2012. Again, federal actions build on state initiatives. Colorado's rules require leak detection and repair programs for all wells, both new and existing, conventional and unconventional. Altogether, the new rules will remove 100,000 tons of methane and 90,000 tons of smog-forming volatile organic compounds. That's equal to the emissions of all the cars and trucks in the state of Colorado today, year after year after year. Now, I know that this subcommittee is deeply concerned about the potential cost to the industry of complying with state and federal methane rules. But the good news on this issue is not only that cutting methane emissions is generally very inexpensive, but the cost of methane leak detection surveys is relatively low as well. Today, methane inspections can cost as little as $250, and of course, one of the benefits of the EPA regulation is that it's already driving innovation in the private sector. Today, there are 75 companies in 500 different locations in 46 states providing methane reduction services and support. Regulating methane emissions from both new and existing sources is an important and cost-effective step in stopping the worst effects of climate change. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today, and I'm happy to take any questions you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Holstein. Mr. Ventello, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, committee members. My name is Anthony Ventello. I'm the Executive Director of the Progress Authority. We're an industrial development and economic development agency in northern tier of Pennsylvania. I live, work, and have raised a family in the heart of the Marcellus Shale formation. We rank second and first in statewide shale gas, in both Bradford and Susquehanna counties. Over 5,700 wells, 2,200 drilled, 6.5 billion cubic feet per day of production, representing about 245,000 jobs and 33 billion of investment. The answer lies in vertical integration, utilizing the gas. Distribution is critical. Please, could I have 2 slides ahead? Distribution is critical. Next slide. One of the issues is at a simple, very low-level effect is having some of the most prolific wells in the world, over 30 MMCF. There was no local distribution. Nobody could have access to the gas. We've been able to pipe both schools. Actually, in a situation where a school actually has wells on it, they were able to do a post-secondary school from the standpoint of bringing clean natural gas to that location. 2 hospitals have been built in that region, both having natural gas services. In fact, some of the drilling companies have participated in the development of that, and you can see the immense amount of investment and jobs that have been created, 51 million and 35 million, and several hundred jobs as a result of it. Infrastructure, next slide, please. Infrastructure has been critical. We're now looking at, in both virtual and new pipelines, where new pipelines have been curtailed. There's been several new virtual pipelines being developed along interstate corridors, both with LNG, liquefied natural gas, and CNG, compressed natural gas. But we have to get the gas to locations to be utilized and marketed. Under the energy generation, next slide, please. I just toured 2 brand new facilities in our region. One is an 829 megawatt combined cycle facility, Panda Power Station, about $900 million of new investment, eliminating oil and coal facilities, as well as the smaller facility, 20 megawatts. There's 7 proposed in our area. I've just toured the 2nd completed one, 7 sites throughout our area, but they also represent about 20 million and jobs created along with those. One of the interesting elements is that combined heat and power has been a massive undertaking, and a lot of our larger facilities, both in education, industrial development, or manufacturing, and as well as hospitals have been getting involved in combined heat and power projects under construction. In the instance of hospitals, you're seeing one mainly only because of medical record demand. Now with the increased automation, Cornell University, GTP, and Procter & Gamble, 2 of which I want to identify. But again, substantial investment, substantial support of job creation. One I want to identify for you is a 30-megawatt combined cycle station. That's Cornell University. They're very proud of this. I toured this facility. Keep in mind, it has substantial support of over 12,000 employees and 21,000 students, and it's an anti-natural gas institution. They're very proud of that facility. Infrastructure along the lines of CNG. We have both public fueling stations, compressed natural gas stations, private, as well as public transportation is now being funded with, or fueled, excuse me, with compressed natural gas. Next slide, please. Industrial utilization has led to a lot of utilization and innovation with natural gas. Over 5,500 local jobs are being supported with natural gas. We have strong manufacturing with natural gas, and an effort to reshore manufacturing into the United States is critical upon having cheap, clean, cost-effective natural gas available. Worldwide example, I claim this is the worldwide example of natural gas utilization and there's not a better example of it. Procter & Gamble has about 1,500 acres. They have the luxury of unconventional drilling on their site. They have a net zero cost for both energy generation, thermal demand, and of course they call it tri-generation. They're a paper producer. They use hot air, which is usually a waste product from combined heat and power, but supporting over 3,000 employees at that location. Gas to liquids. This is an innovative project. Most people don't realize moving along because of the opportunity with gas. This project, I think I need to identify to you, this is a company that's using on the upper area of elderly. That was a burned out furniture store. Features from the standpoint of well pads, water withdrawal locations, compression, and pipelines. One thing I think is extremely critical is the fact that agricultural production is on the rise in our area. As a result, in 2008, it was on a decline, the Marcellus Shale. Since then, it's been on an incline. And if I can just summarize it by saying natural gas has been a complementary land use and has kept land in large parcels, which is conducive to agriculture and maintains a rural way of life. All aspects of soybean, beef, swine, egg production, and niche farming has been on the rise because farmers now have some income to reinvest in the farm. I just want to summarize by saying that increased regulation will reverse the established initiatives that we have in environmental benefits, economic investment in jobs, and energy independence with over-regulation. I want to thank the committee for the opportunity.
Thank you, Mr. Ventello. I'd like to thank all of their witnesses for their testimonies. Your written testimonies will be made part of the record. Even though this might be a short hearing, we have all of your information here with the committee. Members are reminded that committee rules limit questioning to 5 minutes. I'll recognize myself for the first 5 minutes. Dr. Weinstein, you're an economist. Do the benefits of the methane rule outweigh the costs, and can you explain?
I don't believe so. I think there are costs that are currently unaccounted for in typical, EPA cost-benefit analysis. But don't misunderstand me. I think methane releases are a serious environmental issue. I just believe there are better ways to deal with these issues. I actually attended a seminar 2 days ago. Well, it's actually a webinar, and it was sponsored by Stanford University and Resources for the Future. And it made some very good points. And actually, Mr. Holstein mentioned one of them, that a huge amount of the methane release comes from what are called super emitters. Well, I believe a kind of blanket regulation that would apply to, all producers of natural gas, oil, transmission companies, what have you, makes any sense if we can, if there are, targeted areas that can be addressed in terms of controlling emissions. There are a number of other specific areas that I think can be dealt with a lot more simply than passing a new slew of federal regulations. Another source of emissions is orphan wells. The states have traditionally dealt with orphan wells and any emissions associated with that. We also have some old cities in the Northeast where there are pipelines that are leaking methane. I don't see where EPA has a role to play there. It makes a lot of sense for the cities and the states to initiate policies and take steps along with the distribution companies to replace those old lead pipelines, and that is going on. So on balance, I think what's being proposed in terms of new regulations from EPA on methane emissions, that the costs overall are going to far exceed any benefits.
As far as when you think about the cost and the benefit regarding our impact as one country in the entire world, does that change the calculus?
I would put it this way. If the rest of the world were doing what we're doing in terms of both regulatory and private policies towards reducing greenhouse gas emissions, that would do a lot more to address climate change concerns than just what we do in the United States, as I showed in those two slides, with little, how should I say, little impact from regulations per se. We have seen a tremendous drop in CO2 emissions. We've seen a drop in methane emissions as well. And I go back to the fact that we're not a stagnant economy. We're a growing economy. We're almost twice as large as we were 20 years ago. We've had 100% increase in oil and gas production, and yet emissions are falling. So the industry must be doing something right.
Mr. Milito, wanted to get you on the record. Could you please describe the technological advances that the industry has made to reduce methane emissions?
Yeah, there are several. I think the first one you look at is what we call reduced emission completions, also called green completions. And this is an industry of solutions, and we understand that methane is the main component of natural gas, so we want to capture it. We want to sell it. We want to put it into the market. And one of the technologies that have been developed.
Can you make sure is your mic on?
Sorry.
Okay.
Appreciate that. I was talking about how the industry is an industry of solutions, and when we're looking at an issue like methane, we're looking at the primary component of natural gas. It's the product that this industry sells. Every incentive to make sure we're capturing it. And one of the areas that we realized we needed to be proactive was when we're done with hydraulic fracturing and putting the well into production, the period called completion. So we put together equipment and machinery to make sure that that process doesn't result in venting of gas, venting of methane, and that we're actually capturing it and using it for on-site fuel or for putting it into the market. Other examples are reduction in the use of pneumatic valves and controllers that utilize natural gas and sometimes vent it off, taking those away from the equation or moving to lower venting ones. Eliminating emissions from storage tanks, and the list goes on. But the idea here is that we are an industry that has been very active in deploying these technologies well before EPA put any regulations forward. And I would say that the EPA regulations are in many respects a lagging indicator of the industry because they're based upon technologies the industry has proactively developed.
Now, when you think about the study I mentioned earlier from Energy in Depth, we're talking about a change in global temperatures of 0.004 degrees Celsius over the next 84 years. Does that assume that the technological advances that are currently being made are not implemented or are implemented?
Well, I think there's different ways to look at it. One way to look at it is understanding U.S. overall GHG emissions, of which methane constitutes 10%, of which U.S. oil and gas methane emissions are about 4%. So think about that. We're talking about 4% of total greenhouse gas emissions, of which these rules are intended to maybe get 40%. So we're not talking fractions of U.S. greenhouse gas emissions that these rules are intended to go after, yet at the same time, it's unclear that they're going to provide any appreciable benefit beyond what the industry is already doing. So we're adding tremendous costs that could be ultimately applied to 1 million wells, ultimately impacting the consumer in a very negative way, because when our supply goes down, what happens to prices? The pressure is upward on prices. So we got to question these types of actions when we're talking about fractions in the overall scheme of things.
Copy that. I'd like to recognize Ms. Bonamici for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before I begin my question, I just wanted to comment on the opening statement of the chairman. There was a citation to a NOAA study for the premise that the U.S. energy industry contributes little to the overall burden of global fossil fuel emissions. We're a little concerned about the attribution of that comment because the NOAA study did not separate out U.S. from global emissions. So we're, just for the record, going to be following up to with NOAA and correcting, putting any correcting information in the record. Mr. Holstein, we talked a little bit about Aliso Canyon and how alarming that was, and the thousands of people who had to evacuate, and many became ill. And I know no one wants to see that kind of incident repeated. So would you please talk a little bit about what can be done to prevent similar incidents in a newly constructed facility? And importantly, will you please address the notion that's come up both in some of the statements from the dais, but also in some of the testimony, that voluntary efforts will be sufficient. Can you address that issue? Will voluntary efforts be sufficient without the EPA's involvement? Thank you.
Certainly, thank you. Aliso Canyon was a terrible tragedy, and I know your question is about new facilities of that kind. But we should note that there are some 400 similar facilities all around the United States. And so we do need to be concerned about the existing facilities as well. But with respect to both those and especially a new facility, the single most important thing to address in the construction of a new storage facility would be well integrity. And now typically these facilities make use of old oil and gas, depleted oil and gas fields in order to re-inject natural gas into those fields for long-term and sometimes short-term storage also, in order to help meet spikes in demand that may occur during a heating season, for example, or for sudden surges in demand for electricity in the summertime. So the first step, of course, is well integrity, to make sure that you've got the well constructed correctly. The second category of actions you want to take is to have a leak detection and repair set of protocols so that you see what's happening, so that you can get a handle on these problems before they become a 3 or 4 month disaster requiring thousands of people to be evacuated. And indeed, just 2 days ago, the company responsible for that leak did agree to a comprehensive new set of leak detection and repair protocols in their legal discussions or negotiations with the county. The state is still developing their case, but I think the fact that there is this focus on using the new leak detection technologies that are becoming available is instructive for the larger issues relating to methane.
And what is your response to the suggestion that the industry can address this issue without regulation?
If we look at the scale of the problem, which has been detailed by EPA's recent inventory, showing a 34% increase over their previous estimates, but in particular, if we look at the power of the methane molecule, it's an enormously powerful, nasty climate actor, and as you stated, 84 times more powerful than a molecule of carbon dioxide. And what that really means is we can't afford to wait for the industry to play catch up with the science. And part of the problem that the industry has, Dr. Weinstein is correct as far as he goes in saying that these random events are significant, but the emphasis I have to place is on the word random. A lot of this is counterintuitive. You can't simply make an assumption that old facilities are going to leak more than new facilities, or the other way around. Enormously random, and that's why you need comprehensive leak detection.
And can you talk a little bit about, you mentioned Colorado. They were successful in developing regulations, and how is that working in Colorado?
Oh, it's working spectacularly well, and the best example I can give you of that is the fact that they've removed pollutants from the air there as a direct result of those rules. A road in the state of Colorado, and I would note that those rules, which are really national, really leading the country, those rules were put in place with the collaboration of the 3 largest oil and gas developers in that state at the time. Environmental Defense Fund was there as well to help provide some technical input as well, and it was an open process. But it was truly led by the industry in saying, we do need a comprehensive set of rules, we need them uniform, and we need the rest of the industry to get on board.
Terrific. Thank you very much, and I see my time has expired. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Before going to Chairman Smith, Mr. Milito, would you comment on Aliso Canyon and how it relates specifically to the rule?
Yeah, Aliso Canyon, very serious situation, something we never want to see happen, don't want to see happen again, but it's completely unrelated to the EPA rules we're talking about today. We take this very seriously, and the oil and gas industry, as I mentioned, is an industry of solutions. We as API are a standard-setting organization. We create the standards for safe and environmentally responsible operations that are relied upon around the world. That's how we started. We have 2 new documents related to underground storage to make sure this type of incident doesn't happen. They relate to issues such as well integrity, so we've come forward with a solution. The other thing I would add is that this is not being ignored by the federal government. It's not an EPA issue. PHMSA is looking at this and addressing it and working with an interagency task force that includes API, our companies, and we're moving forward in a way where the companies are already implementing these standards. So it is wrong to conflate Aliso Canyon with emissions of methane from production facilities. They're totally separate issues.
Thank you. Just wanted to get that on the record. Chairman Smith, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, let me say it's a credit to our witnesses today and to the importance of the subject matter that so many members came back after our only vote of the day to be at this hearing. I just want to follow up before I get to my first question and say I agree with those who have expressed the sentiment today that obviously methane and carbon emissions have been going down, but largely because of technological breakthroughs. The last thing we need are more government regulations which are ineffective, don't have any significant impact. It is much better to let technology provide the solution, as it always has for the history of our country. The mindset that the government knows best is not, I think, a productive mindset. Mr. Milito, let me address my first question to you, and it is this. In what ways do you feel it is that the EPA has misled us when it comes to the benefits of of the methane regulations?
Well, I think this gets back to the underlying science and whether or not we have a system, an economy, an industry that are already effectively addressing the methane issue. And if you look at some of the research of Environmental Defense Fund, they've come forward and said, if we keep supply chain emissions of methane below a 2.7 to 3.2% range, we get the environmental benefit. Now, the EDF studies that look at the equipment on sites, the EPA inventory, this data shows that 1.5%, maybe 1.8%, all the data shows we're well below that. So we are in a situation right now where the data shows that we get this huge benefit from producing natural gas because it's clean burning, not just from a climate change standpoint, but from traditional pollutants as well, things like NOx, SOx, particulate matter. So we are winning. We're doing what we need to do without the regulations. Now, we have EPA regulations put forward. They do a regulatory impact analysis. It's a wash. If you look at EPA's own numbers, it's a wash. But then when you go back and apply the real data, the better data, the more certain data, it shows that in a year like 2025 and beyond, we can be looking at costs more than $1 billion from a rule like this.
Mr. Milito, this is exactly the information we need to get out, and I thank you for making those points. Dr. Weinstein, in what ways is the modeling system used by the EPA flawed or biased?
I'm not really qualified to speak about the specifics of the EPA models. I have not studied them. My knowledge, my understanding is simply based on...
perfectly fine.
Yeah.
We'll come back in a minute. Mr. Ventello, let me ask you about the impact of the EPA regulations, and I might ask Dr. Weinstein, Mr. Milito as well. What is the impact of the regulations likely to be on economic growth and job creation?
Well, from the standpoint of the industry itself, additional burden with low cost right now, with pricing being down, as well as the fact that the industry's been pretty much self-policing. We see a lot of improvements in what they've done, and of course, as it's been stated, the release of methane is a loss of dollars. So there's a lot of effort to try to make sure that they do things to current standards. Okay. But in essence, right now, in a low-cost environment, it would have a substantial impact long-term just because of additional cost in not only improving the wells, but also completions and transmitting. The key really lies in moving the gas so that you can minimize the amount of methane that is emitted from an idle situation.
Okay, thank you. And,
But
yes.
we tend to forget that we are the world's #1 natural gas producing country, and that we're also getting into the business of exporting natural gas. That has tremendous economic benefits, in addition to the environmental benefits of natural gas that we've discussed. The fact that we are #1, that this is an industry that is not only powering the U.S. economy, but employs lots and lots of people, and now we're getting into the export business. So I think we need to be very careful in assessing new policies or regulations that can make it more expensive for us to produce and sell natural gas unless there's overwhelming evidence that the benefits of regulation exceed the cost.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Weinstein. Mr. Milito, what about you? What about the economic impact, and what about the impact on jobs?
It could be huge. The general rule. I'm sorry. I got to get better with my button here. It could be huge. The general rule of thumb, based upon what a lot of the economists will look at, is that for each BCF of production that we have of natural gas in the U.S., you get 32,000 jobs. So we've gone from 52 BCF per day in 2007. We're at about 74 now. So, just do the math, and we're talking hundreds of thousands of jobs. So you have regulations that could increase the cost on the industry dramatically. A more recent ICF study shows that it could be $3.35 per MCF, and that's based upon applying a lot of the same technologies that EDF says would cost a penny. Natural gas now is $2.90, doubling the cost of developing a resource or a product that you're selling for $2.90. It just could be devastating to consumers overall.
Right. Thank you, Mr. Milito. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, may I, before we go on, because Mr. Milito mentioned the EDF and Mr. Holstein is here, is it appropriate to have Mr. Holstein respond to the mention of his work?
Let's go to Ms. Edwards, and then maybe she can yield.
Thank you.
Okay. It's Ms. Edwards, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
I might yield. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses as well. Mr. Holstein, in his testimony, Dr. Weinstein described the methane regulations as a, quote, solution in search of a problem. And I wonder if, based on your testimony, I suppose you would disagree with that. You mentioned that the knowledge base for methane is just kind of catching up. We have a huge knowledge base for CO2 emissions. Where relatively would you put our knowledge base of methane emissions with respect to CO2?
I would say catching up fast. 5 years ago, nobody was paying attention to methane as a major climate pollutant. The NOAA study that was referred to earlier in its very first sentence references the fact of that there are emissions that are of concern, and throughout that study mentioned methane prominently. Mr. Milito did mention EDF studies. I actually appreciate that mention because I think it's been remarkable how we've come together on the environmental side with the industry in conducting some of these studies, which are peer-reviewed and which are supervised by and designed by outside independent scientists. We can disagree about what the policy implications of those results are, but I do have to correct him on one point, which is we believe that the cumulative results of our scientific work show that we need to get methane emissions from this sector down at or below 1%, not 2.7, at or below 1%. If you're going to have an improvement over what you would otherwise get if you were, for example, burning coal.
So let me ask you a little bit about that, because I think there's some confusion. First of all, the EPA regulations that we have discussed, EPA has imposed regulations, has put forward final regulations on new and future methane productions, right?
Yes.
And they have not done any regulating on existing, there are no proposed regulations on existing operations. Is that correct?
Also correct, yes.
And so we're really speculating here as to what EPA is going to do just because they're gathering information. It's kind of their job to gather information, isn't it?
It is.
So I wonder, can you also clarify, natural gas is still a fossil fuel, right?
It is.
And it's cleaner burning than coal and other fossil fuels. Is that right?
Yes.
Which is good. But there are still environmental impacts and public health impacts from methane emissions.
Yes, and it's cleaner burning relative to coal, to answer your question of a moment ago, only if you get the fugitive emissions down at or below 1%. And that is not where we are, and that's where we need to be. Otherwise, those environmental benefits simply don't accrue.
And so in your examination of some of the industry-led reports of cost-benefit analyses, do they take into consideration, in your experience, do they take into consideration the public health costs?
They often do not, and I gave the example of Colorado, where the measures that are undertaken, and remember, this was a program put in place with the collaboration and cooperation of industry itself, the biggest producers in the state, puts the industry in the position of, in Colorado, of taking huge amounts of pollutants out of the air, not just the climate change. If you didn't care about climate change at all, you would still welcome the dramatic reductions in smog forming ground level ozone and in the volatile organic compounds that include toxic air pollutants. And there we're talking about premature deaths, asthma, hospitalization, and I refer you to the American Lung Association's letter on this point of December, which we'd be happy to submit for the record.
Thank you. And so my time is running out here. And so I want to give Mr. Milito an opportunity to respond. In your testimony, you say there are significant costs. You're referring to the regulations without commensurate benefits. Does your analysis take into consideration public health costs as well as the economic costs?
We are looking at this from a climate standpoint. Methane is not a toxic pollutant. This is a climate question that we are talking about, and we're looking at whether or not we are achieving methane emission reductions without the costs imposed by the regulations. So
It's a fossil fuel, though, right? It is a fossil fuel.
it is a fossil fuel.
And it does still have some of the same public health costs as other fossil fuels, maybe just not to the same extent. Isn't that right?
Well, it's providing an environmental benefit to the public when you use it rather than other natural gas, other fossil fuel powered power plants.
Thank you, Mr. Milito.
The gentlewoman yields back. Just want to make it clear on the record, back in May, EPA Administrator McCarthy stated that she will expedite issuing regulations for reducing methane emissions from existing sources. So that is not speculation. That comes from the EPA Administrator, Gina McCarthy. I now recognize Mr. Palmer for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd just like to point out that there's still serious debate over whether or not the climate is warming. I think there's research out that shows we haven't had a significant increase in temperature in 18 years. So that's probably, Mr. Chairman, probably going to make me subject to some kind of government retribution or a trial or something, I don't know, for that, as is going on with some of these AG trials. Mr. Weinstein, according to the Environmental Protection Agency's own estimates, methane emissions in the United States have decreased by 6% between 1990 and 2014. During that time period, has natural gas production in the United States increased or decreased?
It's increased about 70%.
If we do nothing at all, will the methane emissions from oil and natural gas sector continue to decrease?
Yes, I believe so. As we've heard from Mr. Milito, the industry is embracing the best available technology to capture methane, and that is one of the reasons that we see this long-term decline.
And one of the reasons that we have such abundant supplies of natural gas now is because technology, is that correct?
That's correct.
And it continues to improve almost on a daily basis, is that correct?
Yes, it's really incredible if you consider that the rig count is down 70% over the last 2 years, and gas production is only down about 7%. That indicates that we're getting much more efficient in our ability to produce
Methane
natural gas.
capture at the wellhead technology, that technology is increasing at a rapid rate. Is that also true?
Yes, it is, and most states do have standards for capturing methane.
And the methane that's emitted from wellheads is relatively small amount compared to other methane sources. Is that correct?
In the overall scheme of things, yes.
Mr. Milito, EPA issued 5 technical white papers covering compressors, emissions from well completions, leaks, liquids, unloading, and controllers and pumps. Did the EPA properly take into account concerns that were raised by various stakeholders during the supposed peer review?
And not all the concerns that we had with the rules, particularly with the targeting of methane as the pollutant in this case. We felt that we could have done it without that.
In your experience and observations, does the EPA actually take into account these concerns, or does it simply find friendly reviewers who will rubber stamp its agenda? That's,
Well,
that's a loaded question, but I'd like for you to give me your opinion.
I would like to say that the process that we're going through with EPA is actually better in many respects than what we're seeing with the Bureau of Land Management. We have meetings with EPA. We talk about them. We talk about our technology. So there is a lot of back and forth, so I would commend them for that. And they're going through a process for understanding what the data is before they move forward with potential regulations on existing sources. On the other side of the house, we have Bureau of Land Management putting forward regulations for existing sources on federal lands without the benefit of all that data and all that knowledge. So the preferred path, if you're going to have a path, is to go through and have an analysis of the data before you move forward and try to rush regs through.
Well, despite all the voluntary reductions, and as Mr. Weinstein pointed out, we continue to have a reduction in methane emissions despite the fact that gas production has gone up tremendously. It kind of comes across like the government selectively focusing on your industry, ignoring the benefits. You know, it's such a contradiction here that they're concerned about greenhouse gas emissions, and they forced the coal industry basically to go bankrupt, as promised by our president when he was campaigning the first time. They've destroyed thousands and thousands of jobs. They've forced power companies to convert from coal to natural gas. And even though natural gas prices have gone way down, energy costs have gone up, it just concerns me that there's not a balanced approach to this in regard to looking at the economic benefits and the benefits in terms of reduction of greenhouse gases versus the benefits versus whatever very limited impact that methane might have. It appears to me there's another agenda here. I appreciate the time, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back, and now recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Weber, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gosh, I don't know who to direct this to. I'll just make a comment. On ecology.com, they made the statement that fossil fuels were, I mean, if you kind of read their statement, it looks like they're don't have a big problem with them, but the problem with them was they weren't renewable, and that one day we would run out of them. And that may interest you to know that article was written by Erik Milito on September the 6th, 2011. So things change. You know, it seems like there's a rush to judgment. The EPA has decided that fossil fuels are bad, and I keep hearing questions from our colleagues over on the other side here. They keep saying, well, but it's a fossil fuel, isn't it? As if somehow that's the kiss of death, I guess. Mr. Milito, the EPA issued 5 technical white papers covering compressors, emissions from well completions, leaks, liquids unloading, and controllers and pumps. Did the EPA properly take into account concerns that were raised by various stakeholders during that supposed peer review?
No, the final documents that were, I don't even know if they released. I think that after taking comment, they didn't make any changes to the document. So nothing was incorporated from the public input standpoint. They just stuck with really the original peer-reviewed documents.
So it was all an exercise in futility, it was what it sounds like. I own an air conditioning company, 34 years. I've dealt with the EPA over refrigerant, trade name DuPont, Freon issues for a long time. When I was in the Texas legislature, we dealt with licensing regulations, Texas Department of Licensing Regulation, TDLR, on air conditioning contractors. I wanted somebody on the board that actually had experience with air conditioning, or with whether it was refrigerant or whether it was the actual industry, not somebody that had been through school and through class and read the books and decided under the tutelage of some professor that their job was to regulate greenhouse gases or the evil energy industry. Dr. Weinstein, you have a comment.
Well, you make a very good point. I think the environmental community overall is trying to tar the oil and gas industry as being evil, like the tobacco industry. As we sit here today, there is a demonstration going on in front of the White House by the Keep It in the Ground movement, and this movement is growing. So there's so much misinformation about energy, fossil fuels. Not all fossil fuels are created equally. I mean, there are lots of reasons that we're using less coal.
Actually, they are created equally. They just decay at different levels. Go ahead.
Well, that's one way to look at it.
Okay.
But yeah, so the political environment in which regulation is being crafted today is very highly charged. And unfortunately, there doesn't seem to be a middle ground or a rule of reason. There's this growing perception that fossil fuels are bad. The environmental community used to think that, oh, natural gas, that's a great bridge to the future. Now they say it's a bridge to nowhere.
Well, it's a fossil fuel,
But
as if that's something bad.
But the reality is, the Department of Energy says that fossil fuels are going to remain our primary energy source for the next 40 or 50 years. And that's good news.
Dr. Weinstein, we have how many years of natural gas by some estimates? One or 200 years?
That changes by the day. I mean,
Right.
there was a discovery announced a couple of days ago in West Texas, the high Alpine.
Absolutely.
This huge, billions,
8 billion,
billions
right.
of cubic feet of natural
Well,
gas.
the article I cited from ecology.com, we were going to run out of natural gas this was September the 6th, 2011, clearly before the thing. Mr. Milito, you also said, and I missed the numbers in your earlier testimony, that 1 billion CF of natural gas produces how many jobs? You quoted
1 billion BCF per day of natural gas equates to approximately 32,000 jobs.
32,000 jobs. One of the things I say when I speak to groups around the country is that the things that make America great are the things that America makes. Now, how do we do that? We have a reliable, affordable, dependable, clean source of energy for the most part. I get there's problems where the pipelines rupture. You were talking about PHMSA earlier, and of course, you know that the pipeline industry, Mr. Milito, has a 99% safety rating. And so for this idea to be that somehow we've got to kill all this fossil fuel energy and go on either solar or wind, and that's not even discounting for nuclear that I used to have in my district when I was in the state legislature. It just boggles my imagination that we've got an agency that we have reduced their budget to by $420 million into pre-1989 levels, and they're still pumping out regulations, as you pointed out, with a supposed comment period. They're still pumping out regulations at a record rate. I think we need some cooler heads to prevail. I think we need some logic to prevail. The EPA is supposed to take into account the effects on what it does to the industry before they issue regulations. And we really, quite frankly, don't see them doing that. And I hope that Congress exercises its oversight control and gets that under control. And I appreciate you all being here to testify. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I now recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Babin, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Ventello, according to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, excessive heat is the leading cause of preventable weather-related deaths each year. particularly among the elderly. In June of 2013, President Obama in a New York Daily News editorial stated that the bottom line is natural gas is creating jobs. It's lowering many families' heat and power bills. Do you find it ironic that these deaths from excessive heat could be prevented by electricity, cheap, reliable natural gas from Pennsylvania or even New York, instead of lowering electricity usage has been encouraged by Governor Cuomo?
Yeah, it is ironic. We with the surge of this cheap fuel, obviously the industry itself, energy generation is probably the most prolific, if you will, development with natural gas that reaches more people than any other single use of natural gas. We all use electricity. So to answer your point, yes.
Okay. And then, do you think citizens have been misinformed by the media and certain advocacy groups about natural gas well operations?
I believe so. And let me give you just a simple example.
Okay.
Our emergency operations director, for instance, if a tanker of diesel fuel spills delivering fuel to a family farm, that's one day's news. If a vehicle or some sort of a accident happens with a gas-related vehicle, he gets a call from the media looking for that separation. That becomes news in the New York Times. I see it all the time. People send me that information. So yes, there is a strong misinformation. I think the most powerful thing I can do is ask people to come there and see it and make up their own minds.
Do you think that these advocacy groups are aware of the progress that has been made in this industry on reducing methane emissions?
I think that in many cases, they may be, but there's nothing you can say that will convince them to change their minds.
I got you. And then how would poorly thought out, hasty regulations stop economic revitalization and development that has been occurring in Northeast Pennsylvania?
Simply by placing unnecessary burden by additional costs on the industry, which is already moving in the right direction.
And then would it be fair to say that the production of natural gas has benefited the entire community, such as the building of new hospitals, thus improving the health quality of all residents of Northeast Pennsylvania?
Yes, and beyond that, everything that you and I use, the industry uses, and there's been an extreme, in many cases, where the industry has been made to pay impact fees. Those dollars have gone back into a lot of different benefits to the general community, both in healthcare as well as housing and the like.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ventello, and I appreciate all the witnesses today. I'll yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. We're coming to the end of this hearing. Mr. Milito, did you want to, I'll give you about a minute. If
Yeah, I have a correction
and just-
for Congresswoman Edwards. I'm actually looking at our regulatory impact analysis, and we did, in fact, look at the benefits of reducing methane emissions. And in one case, there were actually, our estimates showed that they were greater than what the government showed. But at the same time, we saw the cost appreciably higher, which gives you a much lower net benefit overall. And I would look at the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which states that greenhouse gas emissions from energy supply can be reduced significantly by shifting to modern, highly efficient natural gas combined cycle power plants. So we have the data which shows that we're in a good position, and it just begs the question as to whether or not these regs are required. And the last thing I would ask is to get some confirmation from the EDF, because it's news to me that it's 1%. All the studies that we've seen show you have to be lower than 2.7 to 3.2% when it comes to coal. I understand that natural gas in transportation might have a different threshold, but I think we have to get that information correct, so I think it'll be good for all of us to learn that, because that's good information to know.
Mr. Holstein, would you like to take a minute to respond to that?
Yes, just to commit to Mr. Milito that we'd be happy to provide it, and we do note two things that have been referenced. One is that we absolutely do accept and acknowledge the positive role that natural gas has played in helping to improve, for example, our air quality and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Again, underscoring this point that getting a handle on methane is critical to ensuring that the benefits of gas truly do accrue to the society, to the world at large, whether you're concerned about health benefits or climate or both. And the voluntary reductions talking about those are a mixed bag. The green completions that Mr. Milito referred to and some of the other reduction driving measures that have been taken by industry have been taken as a direct result of earlier EPA regulations. That's not to say that there aren't good environmental values in the industry. I mentioned Colorado, where they certainly came to the fore, and One Future is a good example, but One Future's membership is now part of EPA's methane challenge voluntary program, but there are only 10 companies participating, and we need a lot more leadership and participation from the industry, and I hope Mr. Milito's right that the industry is headed in that direction. But we also need, because of some of the complexities of measuring, of detecting, and responding to methane emissions, we do need to have comprehensive methane detection, leak detection, and repair programs in order to really ensure that the industry has the information they need. So when this invisible gas is leaking, people know where it is. I should note, in reference to the list of things like controllers and valves and that sort of thing, many of these components that we've talked about were designed to leak back when nobody gave a thought about methane. They were actually designed to be driven by the pressures in the gas lines. So those are examples of things that are easily fixable, but we need to get on top of it.
Ms. Bonamici, you
Mr.
had
Chairman?
something?
Yes.
Mr. Chairman, I just wanted to note that I was asking about public health benefits, but I'm going to submit a question for the record along with a statement from nurses and physicians about the public health
Absolutely.
costs. So thank you very much.
You bet. Do you have something final?
No, that
Okay.
was Ms. Edwards.
Okay. I'd like to thank the witnesses for their valuable testimony and members for their questions. The record will remain open for 2 weeks for additional comments and written questions from members. This hearing is adjourned. Thank you all.